Uniquely, Union 54 was processing transactions for fintechs who were coming from over 15 different countries. The way that you solve this chargeback fraud is you have to really do difficult things in the beginning, and you have to, at least in my view and our experience, you have to harmonize the way that you do KYC. So in South Africa, where you are, in Zambia, where I am, we've got very different KYC requirements, what financial institutions are expected to provide. And if you want to issue cards at scale and you're targeting the rest of Africa, then you really have to be able to cater for those differences. You have to be able to adjust your strategy as and when developments happen. And even though it's a solvable problem, I don't think we had enough money to be able to do that. I don't think we had enough time to be able to do that. I think it's something, if you look at maybe, let's say, places like Europe, where they've got one digital ID that shows you a true list of your wealth, that's something that you can then introduce so that you can say, if I get a fraudster by the name of Justin, if he's using his driver's license, I'm still going to be able to block any attempts that he makes using his passport. And for a lot of African markets, there's maybe 2 or 3 different identification documents that they could use. And up until all of those are fully digitized, and the main challenge right now is that you get groups who are coming from other parts of the continent where you've never visited as the executive team. So you don't really know when they produce a document that this is legitimate or not. The best thing you can do right now is to allow a third-party KYC provider to tell you with a certain degree of accuracy that this is a legitimate document. But even then, they are not integrated into the Home Affairs databases, so they can't really tell you definitively that this is true or fake. So there's always going to be elements who are going to abuse this gap. So I think the model that we're seeing right now for card issuing is where people are partnering with local banks, so that limits their potential scale opportunity. When we figured out what was happening, one of the first painful calls that we had were to our major investors. So we must have spent like 2-3 hours, maybe like 3 or 4 consecutive days, just going through our findings and just trying to look at what the strategy should be if and when we decide to stop and resuscitate the business. And I'm glad that we went through that experience, because we're able to actually bring along our major investors so they could understand what was going on behind the scenes. And the mistake that I made was, when people were talking about the chargeback fraud that was happening at the time, we just preferred to just put our heads down and just continue building and trying to figure out how we can save the business and come back with a stronger product, versus actually articulating what was happening at the time. And that's partially because I didn't want to do that up until we had all of the necessary information, which took a really long time to be able to find out, right? And in doing so, in talking to some of our smaller investors who were also sharing some of their experience with some of their portfolio companies, it just became very apparent that it wasn't an issue which was isolated to Union 54. And when you speak to some of the portfolio companies, they're incredibly worried about speaking out about what's happening, because there's this term that everybody keeps throwing around, which is protecting the ecosystem. But an ecosystem comes to be because it's got good actors, it's got bad actors, and at the end of the day, you hope that the good actors triumph over the bad actors. And if we really want to get to a point where the industry is moving in concert, where we get to a point where consumers can fully trust these service providers, I think it's very important that we are as transparent as possible about what's happening. And I think there's always been a disadvantage when you talk about the experiences in Africa, because everybody just lumps Africa together. So as a result, less sophisticated investors would say, I don't want to invest in Africa because I once went to a country A and I got hit by a bike. Therefore, everybody in Africa is going to hit me with a bike. Whereas actually, when you talk about what's happening, the reality is that people actually feel confident in what they're doing and the strategies that they're pursuing. And they come to actually realize that by sharing ideas, we could develop solutions that could benefit everybody else. So in our experience, and as we've kind of shown, just being transparent with consumers and being transparent with stakeholders is ultimately the good thing to do in the end. When we spoke with some of our investors about what was happening with the chargeback fraud, it was, I would say, varied experience. So the much more major investors were a little bit shocked about what was happening, but when we started to explain and to actually show some of the things that we were finding out, they actually came to a point that there was no alternative but to stop the business. And we stopped the business, the API, just because we had what I would say a fiduciary duty to the rest of our shareholders. We just raised a seed extension. We could either spend that extension paying for MasterCard fees, paying for chargeback fraud, or we could stop the business, stop making revenue, but still have enough operating capital to be able to do any other idea. So 1,000 lifetimes would always choose that decision again. But then there were much other investors who were very attracted to the idea of a card issuing business, which is scalable, can be sold for like billions and billions of dollars in the next 6 months. And they didn't want to take that long-term view about actually, this is not a good business to be in. Maybe it is for other markets or other parts of the world, but where we are in this point in time, it's not a good business for us. So people were like, maybe you can just continue going and you continue negotiating with the card schemes and you just try to kick out the bad fintechs, people trying to make compromises versus actually dealing with the root issue just because they, as investors, had chosen a field to invest in, and that maybe was specifically B2B solutions to help people have access to Visa or to MasterCard solutions. So the thought of us pivoting was a bit scary because they didn't know how we would fit in as part of that portfolio going forward. But at the end of the day, and I've spoken to a lot of founders who are in the same boat, at the end of the day, if you are the CEO, you are the person who's spoken to all of these investors and you are the person who's employing all of these people and you're the person who's responsible to all of these customers, then you have to do what's right by the company. And that company is made up of very different elements whose interests might change over time. So the quicker that you do it, the better. If you just continue to wait on it and think, maybe they'll change their mind and they'll come around, they won't. And it's nothing to do with you. It's just because they've got other thoughts that you're not aware of.